You want me to direct what? Okay, you know how you made the movie 300? Yeah. Well, we basically want you to do that sort of thing again, but owls. Okay. Hello my beautiful watchers, and welcome to Lost in Adaptation, the YouTube-based review show that's been dedicated to discussing the differences between films and the books they're based on for the better part of 9 years now, because no one's figured out how to stop me yet. Today we're having a gander at the 2010 movie adaptation of the first 3 books in the Guardians of Ga'Hoole series by Kathryn Lasky. If you're a long-time fan of Lost in Adaptation, you might have picked up from previous videos that this film's director, Zack Snyder, has an interesting track record when it comes to film adaptations. He pretty consistently manages to stay impressively loyal to individual scenes, visuals, dialogue, and some stories, but somehow manages to always miss a fundamental plot point, message, or theme of the original story, leaving fans of the source material frustrated. This is how we got Dawn of the Dead without the confirmed death of the entire cast at the end, Watchmen without the intentional nonsensicality of the tentacle monster, Superman without truth, justice, and the American way, and mass murderer Batman, who sure does love shooting guns, pew 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 pew. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about the books that he was entrusted with this time. Lasky is an American author who can boast both an impressive range and volume of publications, with over 100 books under her belt, including long-running series about various talking animals, mystery novels, dramas about finding oneself again after the loss of one's spouse, picture books, historical and geographical non-fictions, and historical dramas about immigration, the suffragettes, and her Jewish brethren surviving the Nazis. She published the first book in the series that would become collectively known as the Guardians of Ga'Hoole in 2003, and in a mere 5 years wrote 14 more of them and added a prequel in 2013 for good measure. These books were of the first category I mentioned, talking animals. They follow the trials and tribulations of Soren, a young barn owl, and his ragtag group of misfit friends of various other owl species. Despite what that description and the cutesy owls on the covers might lead you to believe, these books are possibly not for every young reader, but if you like your children's stories, not afraid of a little horror, a little bloodshed, the occasional murder, and an overarching message warning of the extreme dangers of cult indoctrination and white supremacy, then I really can't recommend them enough. In 2005, Warner Bros. Successfully negotiated the rights to turn the first trio of books into an animated film. The initial plan was for Lasky herself to write the screenplay, but when Zack Snyder accepted the role of director in 2008, a completely new version was written by John Orloff and Emil Stern. While this does at first glance appear to be a bit of a dick move, as far as I can tell, screenplays are one of the very few things that Lasky doesn't have any experience writing, and as we've seen in episodes past, the book's author working on the film can be a bit of a two-edged sword anyway, so yeah. They hired an impressive cast, snapping up as many alumni from other successful franchises as possible, including Helen Mirren, Hugo Weaving, Jim Sturgess, Emily Barclay, Ryan Quanten, David Wenham, Anthony LaPaglia, Joel Edgerton, and Miriam Margolyes, amongst others. When faced with the decision of what to call their film, they apparently declined the simple Guardians of Ga'Hoole and all 3 book titles, The Capture, The Journey, and The Rescue, instead electing a reworded version of Lasky's original working title, The Guardians of Ga'Hoole, The Rise of a Legend, ending up with Legend of the Guardians, The Owls of Ga'Hoole, a title that manages to not only be overly wordy, but somehow uninformative and misleading simultaneously. Anyways, like most films made in this time period, Legend of the Owls, The Guardians of the Owls, wears its desperate desire to be the next Lord of the Rings on its sleeve. In fact, it went even further than most by having Elrond himself recount an old battle between the forces of evil and a last alliance of owls and other owls that decided the fate of Middle Ga'Hoole.
They followed their leader, Lies of Keel, to meet the Pure Ones and their leader, Metalbeak, in a great and final battle. The Battle of the Ice Claws.
Apparently, it was super important to the makers of this film that it look as real as possible, and I don't mean in a photorealistic CGI way, though to be fair, they did a pretty good job with that. I mean, they wanted it to look like it had really been shot with real cameras in a real environment even though it was animated. To this end, the animators took the time to play around with IRL film equipment with Snyder, learning the limitations of filming on dollies and cranes. They also took into account things like how high altitude winds would shake the camera and or blow the birds out of a perfect framing, or how a camera might be buffeted by a whole parliament of owls flying right past it. While this wasn't an entirely original technique, as intentionally imperfectly deploying CGI had been used on shows like Firefly years before, it's still pretty cool that they were willing to go that extra mile to work it into a completely animated feature film like this. Also, props to them for hiring the band Owl City to write and perform an original song for the soundtrack. That's just very funny. As alluded to earlier, Snyder directed this film almost exactly the same way he directed his smash hit 300, with extreme use of dramatic lighting, extended shots that go back and forth between regular speed, fast cranking, and extreme slow motion, and a pretty consistent lack of subtlety in pretty much all things. It doesn't always work, and let's face it, it's a style that's since been so over-parodied it's basically unusable now, but honestly, I think it kind of works for this film. I mean, slow-mo owl flight looks cool, I don't know what to tell you. On release in 2010, Owl Guardians of the Legend of Gahuville was successful financially, but reviews were and still are quite mixed. People were impressed that an animated film for a younger audience was willing to go as dark as it did, but still found the plot as a whole a little underwhelming and predictable. So I guess the big question is, was that because of the books or despite them? Let's talk adaptation. The following are the parts of the film that can be considered loyal to the book, though cards on the table, some of them require somewhat vague wording in order to fit that bill. Soren, the young barn owl, starts his tale living in a comfortable tree with his parents, his brother Clud, and his sister Eglantine, where he's slowly being taught the ways of the birds and being told stories about the heroic exploits of the guardians who live in the Great Gahul Tree. They're waited on by their servant and nurse, Mrs. Pillifer, who is a blind snake. This, I learnt after a little googling, is a reference to a rare but real symbiotic relationship between certain types of owls and snakes. Neither the book nor the film try to work in an explanation for this, so if you felt some confusion when a fucking snake showed up in the owl home, that is technically an adaptation-accurate response. In a deeply unfortunate twist of fate, a yet-to-learn-how-to-fly Soren falls to the forest floor and gets birdnapped by an aggressive pair of adult owls who carry him away to the incredibly misnomered St. Agolius Academy for Orphaned Owls, a hidden colony in a rocky biome. En route, he meets his future BFF Gylfie, a tiny elf owl with a big ol' brain. St. Agolius turns out to be the base of a pseudo-religious cult that indoctrinates new members using a technique called moonblinking that involves exposing owls to a full moon until it scrambles the magnetic compasses in their brain and makes them all zombie-like and biddable, or something like that. Please don't quote me on the science. Fortunately, cunning Soren and Gylfie manage to resist the process and start formulating a two-part escape plan. Step 1, learn how to fly. Step 2, fly away. But until then, they're forced into the rather disgusting job of picking through the regurgitated remains of former owl meals to see if there's bits of a specific type of metal inside, as these flecks play a big role in St. Agolius' plan for world domination. They gain an unexpected ally when they find out that a soldier named Grimble had only agreed to join the cult to save his family and was still fundamentally a good dude. He teaches them the basics of flying, and they're forced to put it into practice very soon after as they're caught in the act. Grimble sacrifices himself to give the youngins a chance to escape, and they unlock their new abilities just in time to make it out of Dodge. They decide to track down the legendary Guardians of Gahul for help stopping the bad guys, and almost immediately run into Mrs. P, their snaky friend, Twilight, a huge great grey owl with an inflated ego, and a burrowing owl appropriately named Digger, and they all form an adventuring band together. While flying towards the sea that the Tree of Gahul is supposedly in the middle of, a murder of crows attempt a regular murder, but are fended off. They finally make it to the big old tree, and while they fail to convince the Guardians to launch an immediate attack on St. Agolius, they are invited to join their ranks. They're assigned a chore, a sort of internship. Soren is apprenticed to an inconsistently grumpy old owl called Easelrib, who's later revealed to secretly be a war veteran who teaches him how to do sick flying moves by throwing him into a series of dangerous environments. Soren's then reunited with his young sister Eglantine, who seems to have gone through some brainwashing of her own, but she manages manages to shake it off with time. Meanwhile, the naughty owl's plan is revealed to be weaponized magnets that affect the owl's before-mentioned brain compasses even worse than the moon. Again, don't quote me on this exact explanation of the science, it is not important. Anyways, Soren saves the day when he realizes that a magnet's well-known kryptonite is fire. He's distressed to discover that his brother Clud is in Team Evil, but defeats him in one-on-one combat because his kryptonite is also fire. Which is honestly fair, most things are weak to fire, except, water Pokemon, but Squirtle's not in this movie. We'll have to talk more about the movie's villain, Metalbeak, later, but for now, suffice to say it is book accurate that there is a nasty motherfucker called Metalbeak who supposedly hides his lack of beak behind a metal mask. I like that they stuck to a lot of the book owl's favourite slang and buzzwords, talking about feelings in their gizzards and swearing to their mix of ancestors and deities, the Glocks.
Some more nice strong gizzards. The tree always needs them.
Like all films based on multiple books, the makers of Owls of Legend, The Rise of the Guardians, face serious issues regarding pacing and structure because each book had its own beginning, middle, and end. How do you make a coherent and satisfying 3 acts out of 9 acts? Well, it probably helped a little that the Guardians of Ga'Hoole books were not overly self-contained. Lasky said she didn't start them intending to write this long series, but you wouldn't know that from reading them, they're pretty continuous. But it certainly wouldn't have helped that there was a surprising lack of unified tone between each of the books. The first, being focused on the horrors of St. Aggie, is more of a dark survival story. The second, as the name implies, is a travelling adventure as Soren and company make their way to the Tree of Ga'Hoole, and the third has more of a Harry Potter Hogwarts vibe as the gang become students of the Guardians and occasionally have to take matters into their own hands and go on extracurricular quests that haven't been approved by their superiors. Such extreme tonal shifts are unusual enough in a book series. In a single film, they'd be downright jarring. Another obvious issue they had to overcome was the complete story they were adapting was not a trilogy. It was a bloody pentadecology. Is that how you say 15-book story? My sources seem to disagree on this subject. The Rescue doesn't have a satisfying ending. Of the 3 books that went into the film, it's the one that's probably the most focused on just being a setup for later novels. The writer's solution seems to have been to focus on the capture for the first half of the film, then discard quite a lot of the journey and the rescue, and writing their own original plot to fill in the gaps, one that maintained the darker elements of the first book and facilitated an epic battle between the Guardians and the Pure Ones at the end. In principle, this isn't a terrible way of handling it, as it provides a semi-satisfying ending to the film while leaving room to continue the story if so desired, but the cost regarding the plot of the second and third books was high. On top of that, the stuff from the first novel that was included was heavily simplified. For example, the way that Saint Agolius forced people to join their ranks was extremely streamlined. You're forced to sleep in the full moonlight and you go immediately robot-brained. Job's a good one. Dark as it sounds, especially because it's in a frickin' kid's book, it seems like Lasky drew on a lot of real-life indoctrination and brainwashing techniques for her novel. Book Saint Agolius only started by using the scrambling effects of the moon, and they deployed it in the same way that a human might use sleep deprivation to break someone's sense of self. They forced all the owl babies to march around in circles, saying their own name over and over again until the word became meaningless in their own minds, forcing them to respond to the dehumanizing number they'd been assigned on arrival. Owlizing? You know what I mean. They were then subjected to a grueling system of punishment. When Soren was caught asking a question, he was publicly, agonizingly plucked of all his wing feathers as a lesson and example to others. They were then paired with older members of the cult who were programmed to randomly state just how happy they were and how satisfying was their work, encouraging them to do the same, thus forcing them to convince themselves that it was true through repetition. Most disturbingly of all, they were assigned a token parent figure who would insist on being called auntie or uncle, and pretend to look out for them while actually being some of the most vicious owls of the lot. By being the only ones to ever show any kindness to their captives, they eventually commanded absolute power over them, and used that to encourage absolute loyalty and discourage any independent thought. It was honestly pretty damn harrowing reading about poor Soren and Gylfi desperately trying to resist all this undetected for months while they waited until they were big enough to fly. Related, Soren was a lot younger in the book. He starts off as just a teeny tiny chick, making his fall from the nest a lot more emotionally devastating. He seems basically on the cusp of being able to fly at the start of the film, which cut down on his time in the cult significantly. Presumably, to further simplify things, Legend of Zelda, the Guardians of the Galaxy, smooshes what were originally two separate evil owl factions into one. The Pure Ones, who were the Taito Barn Owl supremacists that Cludd ran off to join, weren't associated with Saint Agolius. In fact, it's discovered late in the game that they were actively fighting each other. The world wasn't big enough for two child-indoctrinating avian cults. The very existence of Metalbeak and his Pure Ones is a fairly last-minute reveal in the third book, though the presence of something potentially worse than Saint Aggie had been hinted at here and there. This mysterious threat had become unofficially nicknamed the You Only Wish by Soren and his band because one of Metalbeak's victims had cryptically said, "You only wish it was Saint Agolius," with his dying breath. Cludd gets a lot more screen time in the film and is made into a significantly more sympathetic character. It's made clear at the start that he's dealing with some pretty severe psychological issues, including an inferiority complex and a desperate need for identity that's taken advantage of when he's kidnapped by St. Aggs. Cludd is a total hate sink in the book. He's an entitled, weird asshole in the short period the family's all together, and far from falling from the nest with Soren as shown in the movie, he was the motherfucker who kicked him out of the nest and then tried to kill Mrs. P to cover it up. That's the last we see of him for the better part of 3 books, until a skirmish between Soren's band and Metalbeak and a squad of Pure Ones, where, plot twist, it's revealed that Cludd is Metalbeak, having joined the supremacist Taitos, then killed the original Metalbeak and taken his Metalbeak mask for himself. While the film demoted Cludd to minion so the original Metalbeak could be the final boss, the ending seems to suggest that a sequel would bring it back around to something more book accurate. The books were big into mysteries and twists like this, none of which were carried over into the film in any meaningful way. What few big reveals were included in the film original parts of the plot were broadcast so hard they basically weren't reveals at all. For example, they invented a new character called Lord Allomere, a traitor in the Guardians' higher-ups allied with Metalbeak. He's first introduced in the shadows with a helmet on to maintain some level of anonymity, but as soon as he turns up for real, he's so cartoonishly evil, it was honestly mildly insulting that he wasn't a red herring. I also feel like his presence opened up the film to some plot holes the book didn't suffer from, like why the heck would he bring Eglantine back from his fake scouting mission if there was any chance that she would snap out of her moon blinking and spill the beans on him? Which is exactly what happens. Now, we might be in slight danger of dipping into my personal interpretation here, but I distinctly remember picking up on an element of disappointment in regards to the group finally finding the Guardians of Ga'Hoole in the book. It's not that they weren't fundamentally good or impressive bird warriors, but they weren't exactly what Soren was expecting either. They were more, I guess the word is realistic. They turned out to be an actual military organization with a keen awareness of the logistics of their missions, the consequences of overextending their forces, and a ton of necessary job roles that aren't combat related, instead of the one-dimensional order of super knights with an unbendable moral code ready to ignite their owl lightsabers and run off to fight the evil as soon as they learn about its existence. It's also a bit of a blow to Book Soren to be told that joining their ranks would require years of training, which would start with being assigned tasks so potentially humdrum, they are literally called chores. The film Guardian's unwillingness to launch an immediate rescue mission to retrieve all of the kidnapped owls was pretty much all down to Lord Allomere making dismissive speeches about Soren's stories, and then they do exactly that when Metalbeak orders Allomere to lead them into a trap. Just so we're clear here, by the end of Book 3, the Guardians of Ga'Hoole were yet to do anything regarding the cult of murder owls stealing hundreds of children. Soren wasn't originally attacked by anything on the forest floor, though he was pretty concerned about raccoons. The film introduces a tussle with what the behind-the-scenes info claims is a Tasmanian devil, but I think we all know an ROUS when we see one.
Rodents of unusual size? I don't think they exist.
Bats are used more in the film, being the keepers of the magnets and the disposable foot soldiers of the Pure Ones, which is You know, it's fine, whatever, but their short appearance in the book was hecking more disturbing than that. As soon as a brainwashed St. Algolius owl came of age, once a week they'd all go down and lay on the floor of a cave and let vampire bats feed on their blood while they vacantly stare at the ceiling and tonelessly chant about how great it is that doing this helps reduce their feelings and how awesome it is being empty shells that are there to serve the greater good. Twilight suffers a bit from a lack of screen time, but otherwise he's reasonably book accurate. Digger, on the other hand, is promoted to the main comedic relief, which in this case means being extra as fuck.
Oh, an ambush! Well, I bet you didn't count on this.
It's another thing that works pretty well in the film, but it's weird when you look at it from an adaptation perspective, because just before his introduction in the book, Digger had witnessed his entire family die, and his brother get eaten alive by cannibals. He was, understandably, not feeling very wacky. Film Soren doesn't know how lucky he is that his parents just rematerialized magically at the end of the film because, well, they were super dead in the book. Poor Soren runs into, well, their ghosts, who tell him that they've had to come back to warn him about something, but unhelpfully have no idea what it is they're supposed to warn him about. And there's a cameo from a sarcastic, fortune-telling echidna in the film that I just cannot place anywhere in the book, though, to be fair, I've not read all 16 of them.
I foretold you so!
I could go on for hours about all of the nuances of the world that Lasky created that didn't make it into the film. Like the many coming-of-age ceremonies that mean so much to young owls. First fledging, first branching, first flight. Just lots of little things that make owl culture feel like something that's developed over time and has meaning. Or like how even the good owls clearly have a systemic issue with racial superiority that's never really addressed. They consistently, condescendingly refer to other birds as wet poopers, and it's weird that none of them see an issue with the blind snakes living to serve them. Indeed, in the Gahul tree, snakes are used as tables for owls. They just lay there patiently while the owls drink tea and eat food off their backs. So that is either a serious unrecognized power dynamic problem or a very specific fetish. Or how it's slowly and subtly revealed that this isn't an alternate magical world they're living in. It's future Earth after something wiped out all the humans and presumably sped up the evolution of all the other species on the planet. That is some deep lore shit to work into the background of a children's novel. Legend of the Owls of Legend just seems kind of shallow without it. Grimble wasn't the only member of St. A's faking being indoctrinated in the book. The first person to try to help Soren and Gylfi out was a very small owl named Hortense, who'd infiltrated the cult years before and had been sneaking stolen eggs out to a team of heroic eagles. Before she could do much for our heroes though, she's caught and executed, though she saved one last egg and we got to see a cool eagle fight out of it. The eagles make a timely return at the end of the capture when they intervene to help the group win a battle with their pursuers. I'm surprised the film let that low-hanging Lord of the Rings connection slip by, but I don't know, maybe it was just too obvious. As mentioned, quite a lot of the journey in the journey didn't make the cut. My personal favourite chapter is when the gang overshot Gahul by like 500 miles and ended up in the frozen north where they were given directions by some very surprised puffins. There was also an important moment where Soren helped defeat an enraged bobcat by dropping hot coal from an owl's blacksmith right into its eye. It led to him being made a fire collector by the Guardians later, which is a very important job that helped with the creation of new owl battle claws. Final thoughts. All in all, I'd say that Snyder and the writers got the basics right, but just the basics. The absolute basics is all the film is. Trying to fit the plots of 3 books into one film is damn near impossible, even when a quarter of the movie's runtime isn't being used up by super slow-mo, so simplification was inevitable. The biggest victim of this was the world building. Lasky slowly but surely invented a shockingly well-developed world that felt complex and deep and hinted at a long, fascinating history without over-explaining it, and filled it with nuanced factions and interesting characters. And at the end of the day, all we really got from the film was kapow! The good owls is fighting the bad owls with bird swords. Isn't that cool? It's not a terrible movie. It had a super solid cast. It's funny, its CGI holds up surprisingly well, and if you like Zack Snyder's directing, it sure is that, but I personally think as an adaptation, it represents a reasonably well-intentioned attempt that fell short across the entire board. Despite the film being profitable, the hinted-at sequel was not not to be. It never got officially ruled out, it just never happened. Some of the cast and crew made noises that they'd be willing to reprise their roles, and rumours about another film surfaced occasionally, but to date, Legend of the Ga'Hoole, Guard Your Owls remains a solitary entity. Well, aside from a half-assed video game tie-in, but I mean, every movie made between like 2001 and 2015 got one of those. 'Twas just the done thing. Thanks for joining me, my beautiful watchers. Throw your boy a like if you like, and if you've got time for another YouTube video, consider one of these. Take care.